In the early 1970s, a TV comedy writer and occasional stand-up comedian named Dick Cavett had his own talk show on the ABC television network. Cavett was, and at this recording still is, a sleight-of-build, soft-spoken Midwesterner with a wry sense of humor and a degree in English from Yale. As a talk show host, Dick Cavett was interested in assembling an eclectic mix of guests for the purposes of thoughtful and intelligent discourse. One of the most infamous episodes of The Dick Cavett Show, however, had nothing to do with thoughtful discourse. It aired on December 15, 1971. Cavett's guests were Gore Vidal, a novelist, essayist, and critic, Janet Flanner, a journalist and Paris correspondent for The New Yorker, who at that time was in her late 70s, and the author Norman Mailer. What ensued in that episode, parts of which can be seen on YouTube, was a verbal shoving match between Vidal and Mailer. Dick Cavett and Janet Flanner were literally caught in between them. Unbeknownst to Cavett, Norman Mailer had arrived at the show under the influence of alcohol, and backstage had headbutted Gore Vidal. Why? Norman Mailer's beef was this. Vidal had recently reviewed Mailer's latest book, The Prisoner of Sex, for the New York Review of Books, and in that review, Vidal had associated Mailer with the novelist Henry Miller, which was fine by Mailer because he admired Henry Miller, except that Vidal had triangulated Mailer and Miller with Manson, Charles Manson, the architect of a series of brutal murders that had taken place only 2 years earlier, in 1969. Vidal implied a shared characteristic among all three men, a fascination with, and even love, of violence. So when Cavett introduced Norman Mailer to the stage, Mailer came out ready to fight. But it wasn't entirely clear, not to Dick Cavett, and not to his audience, what Mailer was so worked up about. Mailer's whole demeanor was testy, pugnacious. Gore Vidal attempted to proffer a little background to their situation, but an irritated Mailer cut him off. "We all know I stabbed my wife years ago," he told Vidal. "We do know that, Gore." That turned out to be one of the less confrontational things Mailer said on that program. Surprisingly, Cavett didn't pick up on it. That is, he didn't turn to Mailer and say, "Well, now that you mention it, Norman, why don't we discuss the fact that in 1960 you stabbed your wife, nearly killing her, and you never served any prison time?" It's probably good that Cavett didn't do that. Mailer was bent on having it out with Vidal over the book review, and delving into even more controversial ground might have escalated matters. And escalating matters with Norman Mailer may not have been a wise idea. Episode 1. We all know I stabbed my wife. Did everyone in 1971 know that Norman Mailer stabbed his wife? Did people in the studio audience or watching at home know all the facts of the case? Or was the incident of Norman Mailer stabbing his wife just something they heard, some part of the Mailer legend? By 1971, people knew Norman Mailer as a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and public figure, but also one who had, largely by his own cultivation, a reputation as a braggart, someone unapologetically loud and provocative. To his admirers, Mailer was bold, irrepressible, as an author a refreshing and entertaining change from other authors who were bookish and shy. To his worst critics, though, Mailer was a chauvinist, a macho buffoon, who, in 1970, on The Mike Douglas Show, had remarked that women were, quote, sloppy beasts, unquote. In 1971, when Mailer appeared on The Dick Cavett Show, he was on his fourth wife, so it may have been hard for the average viewer to remember which wife exactly people were talking about in this incident that Dick Cavett decided not to ask about. But it did happen. Norman Mailer did stab his wife, and it wasn't an accident. It was a crime. Welcome to the party. It is the evening of Saturday, November 19th, 1960, and the party that novelist Norman Mailer and his wife Adele Morales Mailer host in their apartment in Manhattan's Upper West Side is no ordinary party. It's a birthday party for one of their friends, but it's also the occasion for Norman Mailer to announce his intention to run for mayor of New York City, not as a Democrat or as a Republican, but on what he calls the existential ticket. Cocktails flow, music plays, and the party continues past midnight and into the following morning. Sometime around 4 a.m., Norman Mailer enters his apartment kitchen, where his wife Adele is standing talking to one or two of the remaining guests. Norman and Adele exchange words. Accounts vary as to what exactly was said. And then Mailer approaches his wife and stabs her with a knife. Twice. Adele Mailer collapses to the kitchen floor, with her husband reportedly making no attempt to help her. It is other partygoers who get Adele to the hospital, where she undergoes surgery. Her injuries are quite serious. One of the knife wounds had penetrated the membrane around her heart. She survives. Norman Mailer is arrested, but he ends up serving no prison time. His family and his friends do not ostracize him, and Mailer's attack on his wife does not prevent him from later winning the National Book Award, and on two separate occasions, the Pulitzer Prize. How did this happen? Why did it happen? Before we delve into details about Norman Mailer and his second wife, Adele Morales Mailer, their life together, what each of them says about that night in 1960, the aftermath of that episode, and more, let's address a more fundamental question. Who's Norman Mailer? That's a fair question in the year 2023. You might recognize the name Norman Mailer, but depending on your age and your reading habits, you may not be able to name a single book that Norman Mailer wrote. And he wrote more than 24 books in his lifetime, 10 of them novels. What's more, Mailer was a very public writer, outspoken, provocative, political. From the start of his career, Norman Mailer wanted to be more than just a writer. Over nearly 60 years, Mailer tried his hand at being a columnist, an essayist, a film director, an actor, a playwright, and even a poet. In 1960, Mailer published an anthology of his own fiction and nonfiction called Advertisements for Myself, in which he wrote the following, quote, "The sour truth is that I am imprisoned with a perception which will settle for nothing less than making a revolution in the consciousness of our time." Unquote. He did not succeed. Not surprising, perhaps, because that's a pretty high bar to set for oneself. Note, though, that Mailer does not write that he wants to lead the revolution. He wants to make one. And he doesn't specify what kind of revolution, to what end, or even among what people this revolution is supposed to take place. It just sounds lofty and ambitious. To some listeners, it may sound admirable. To others, like someone who fantasizes about being important, being at the center of things, being influential. Most writers just want to write books. But for Mailer, setting the bar extremely high and failing may have been preferable, more appealing, to setting an ordinary bar and succeeding. Anyone can set an ordinary goal and succeed. Someone who sets a high goal, even an impossible one, is respected, even if they fail. Norman Mailer died on November 10, 2007. The cause of death was acute renal failure pursuant to lung surgery. He was 84 years old. When Mailer's obituary ran in the New York Times, you had to dig 22 paragraphs deep, almost halfway through the 3,000-plus word piece, before hitting mention of the fact that in 1960, Mailer stabbed his second wife Adele, quote, seriously wounding her, unquote. That episode is dispensed with in a short paragraph, and then we are moving on to Mailer's 6 marriages and the assertion that, quote, for all his hipsterism, Mr. Mailer was an old-fashioned, attentive father, unquote. 8 years after Mailer's death, on November 22, 2015, the obituary for Adele Morales Mailer in the New York Times began this way, quote, Adele Mailer, an artist and actress who made headlines in 1960 when her husband, the novelist Norman Mailer, stabbed and seriously wounded her at a drunken party in their apartment, died on Sunday in Manhattan, unquote. Half of Adele's 1,200-word obituary is taken up with the stabbing episode, and in the accompanying photo, a young Adele is seated beside her smiling husband, her arm crooked into his, her head leaning adoringly on his shoulder. What readers of the New York Times couldn't tell from looking at this photo was that the photo had been taken on December 21, 1960, at New York City Criminal Court, on the occasion of Mailer being granted an 8-day postponement to the felonious assault charge of stabbing Adele. We will return to that date and to Mailer's court appearances later on in this podcast. 2 days after Adele's obituary ran in the Times, a contributing editor to the New Republic magazine named Michelle Legro published an online piece called Here, We Fixed the Obituary of Adele Morales for You. Legro deleted any reference to the stabbing or even to Norman Mailer, so what remained was a tribute to a woman and a mother who had been an actress, a painter, and a student of abstract expressionist Hans Hofmann. To this post, journalist and author Sarah Weinman added a photo of Adele, unaccompanied by Norman Mailer, quote, since none of the obits ran one, unquote. Adele was born in New York City in 1925. She was her parents' only child, and as a young woman, she had ambitions to be a painter or perhaps an actress. In 1997, Barricade Books published Adele's memoir, The Last Party, Scenes from My Life with Norman Mailer. At the start of that book, Adele is waiting in a cafe for her boyfriend, Ed Fancher, who, with Dan Wolfe and Norman Mailer, would found the alternative weekly The Village Voice, when another young man comes up to Adele to hit on her. This other young man is Jack Kerouac, future author of On the Road. Perhaps introducing Kerouac so early is Adele's way of tantalizing her readers, encouraging them to read on for more famous names. But it's nevertheless unfortunate that Adele should begin her own story by relating herself to men. But perhaps even she would admit that was her life. Adele Morales married Norman Mailer in 1954. They had 2 children together, 2 daughters, before getting divorced in 1962. What was happening in their lives around the time of the stabbing? What are some of the events that led up to the night of November 19th, 1960? Less than 2 weeks earlier, a national election had taken place, and the new President of the United States was a senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy. Handsome, charismatic, and the youngest man thus far to be elected to the office of president, Jack Kennedy seemed to represent all things new, fresh, and exciting. The November 1960 issue of Esquire magazine contained a long essay about Jack Kennedy and that year's Democratic National Convention. The essay, called "Superman Comes to the Supermarket," was by Norman Mailer. This was Mailer's first foray into long-form journalism. Although Mailer had been instrumental in the founding of the alternative newspaper The Village Voice, giving it money and even delivering papers by hand, Mailer had no professional background as a reporter. He had written a column for The Village Voice, but not a very successful one. He was prone to overwriting his allotted word count. He bristled at being edited. He didn't always file on deadline, and the tone of his column could be confrontational, and to some readers, bullying. Mailer wanted to stir up discussion, disagreement. He wanted things to be lively. In the end, he was let go. But with his essay, "Superman Comes to the Supermarket," Mailer could write at length and wax philosophical about Kennedy, the Democrats, party politics, and America. The success of this essay came at a good time for Mailer, personally and professionally. In 1960, Mailer was in what we might call a creative rut. While his first novel, the World War II drama The Naked and the Dead, had been an immediate bestseller, propelling him at age 25 into as much fame as a novelist of that time could enjoy, his next two novels, 1951's Barbary Shore and 1955's The Deer Park, were far from the critical and commercial success of his debut. Mailer had tried doing what other writers had done, going to Hollywood, living in Paris, moving to the suburbs of Connecticut. But by 1960, Mailer was back in New York City with his second wife, Adele Morales, wondering what his next move should be. At this writing, there are 5 biographies of Norman Mailer. The first, Hilary Mills's Mailer, a Biography, appeared in 1982, with Peter Manso's oral history, Mailer, His Life and Times. 1991 saw the release of The Lives of Norman Mailer by Carl Rollison, followed in 1999 by another book titled Mailer, a Biography, this one by Mary Dearborn. Finally, in 2013, came Norman Mailer, A Double Life by J. Michael Lennon. None of the 5 Mailer biographies suggest what I'm about to say, but I find it hard to believe that in 1960, Norman Mailer was not aware that another author, a novelist, who, like himself, had been published in his early 20s with a World War II novel, was venturing into politics. That writer was Gore Vidal. Yes, the same Gore Vidal whom Norman Mailer would confront 11 years later on The Dick Cavett Show. Gore Vidal was a contemporary of Mailer's. He was 2 years younger than Mailer and also had served in the armed services in World War II. Vidal's experience as a maritime warrant officer informed his first novel, Willowaw, published in 1946, the year Vidal turned 21. In 1941, Gore Vidal's stepfather, a stockbroker named Hugh Auchincloss, divorced Gore's mother, and the following year, Auchincloss married Janet Lee Bouvier, whose daughter Jacqueline was, by November 1960, the next First Lady of the United States. In 1960, Gore Vidal ran for elected office. Vidal was the Democratic candidate for New York's 29th congressional district. He ended up losing, but Norman Mailer may have written about Jack Kennedy, but there in the newspaper were photos of Jack Kennedy standing side by side with Gore Vidal. And there, in March 1960, at the premiere of Gore Vidal's play The Best Man, was candidate Jack Kennedy. Gore Vidal had two novels published in the 1940s, Willowaw and The City and the Pillar, and he spent the 1950s writing teleplays for TV and writing mystery novels under pseudonyms. Gore realized, as all writers do, that there isn't a lot of money in writing literary novels, and because he was the grandson of a U.S. senator and knew Washington, D.C. quite well, he tried his hand at politics. By 1960, Norman Mailer was ready to do the same. If Norman Mailer was not in the least bit influenced by Gore Vidal, he certainly was inspired by what he perceived to be the personal power and influence of Jack Kennedy. There are many reasons why a person would run for elected office, and a reasonable expectation of winning is not necessarily one of those reasons. American history is full of men and women who have run for office as a way of representing a cause they hold dear, as a way of influencing the agenda or debates of the primary candidates, as a way of siphoning votes from a candidate they do not want to win, or as an unabashed way to get publicity and media attention. A reasonable person who has no experience holding elected office, no political credentials, no name recognition, no status as a public figure or influencer, might run for political office by starting out small. For example, running for city council, not running for mayor of what, in 1960, was the most populous city in the United States. In 1960, Norman Mailer was clearly looking for something to give his life new direction and drive. He was 37 years old. He had a degree from Harvard, but in engineering, not English, and he had no professional experience as an engineer. In fact, Mailer had no work experience to speak of outside of being a writer of fiction who'd enjoyed great success at 25 with his first novel. He had 3 children, 1 from his first marriage and 2 from his current marriage. What was he going to do? Some men who find themselves in this situation hunker down and get to work, perhaps by taking several jobs, making great sacrifices, and building their way up one step at a time. Mailer, however, had many reasons to consider himself exceptional. He was intelligent, he had done well in school, he had become a best-selling author on his first published novel, and in the eyes of his birth family, he was the center of the universe. He was, by his own estimation, a person who would make a revolution in the consciousness of his time, just like Jack Kennedy, just like great men of history. By being elected mayor of New York City, Mailer would skip over the many rungs of the political ladder that more ordinary people had to negotiate and climb. He wouldn't have to figure out what to do with his engineering degree from Harvard. Like Superman, he would leap in a single bound to the top of the mountain, as easily as his novel The Naked and the Dead had appeared at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. People would listen to him. People would do what he told them to do. He'd be in charge, in command, and who knows, maybe a brief experience in politics would give him material to write about. He could write another novel like The Last Hurrah by Edwin O'Connor, or All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. All he had to do was hold a party in his apartment in New York City, declare his candidacy, and he'd be off to the races. There was one problem. Although, judging from the 5 biographies of Norman Mailer, no one who was around Mailer at the time saw it for the very serious problem that it was. And if they did see it as a problem, they either didn't think anything could be done, or they didn't understand what to do about it. The problem was this. Mailer, at this time, was drinking heavily, self-medicating with pills, and smoking marijuana. All the biographies report this, without going so far as calling Mailer an alcoholic or drug addict. Perhaps the biographers don't feel qualified to make that diagnosis. Perhaps they believe it's obvious, or perhaps they believe that this is just what creative people do. And as his wife Adele Morales once observed to a friend, prior to the night of November 19, 1960, when Norman smoked too much marijuana, he became aggressive, even violent. You're listening to the podcast A Writer's Crime, created and narrated by Tim Lemire. That's me. The musical theme of this podcast is the second movement of the Mandolin Concerto in C major, RV 425, by Antonio Vivaldi. That piece, along with all the musical transitions in this podcast, are arranged and performed by guitarist-composer Raymond Gonzalez. You can find him online at raymondgonzalez.net. Please tune in for our next episode, and thanks very much for listening.